They said Africa couldn't feed itself. They came with white trucks and foreign flags, calling it aid. They delivered grain wrapped in debt, powdered milk wrapped in conditions. But in 2025, one man dared to kneel not in surrender, but in defiance. Captain Ibrahim Traoré didn't speak to cameras. He spoke to the soil. He asked, what if freedom could grow from the ground up? And from that question, he launched the largest cassava initiative on the continent, $200 million strong, funded not by Washington or Brussels, but by the heart of Burkina Faso itself. This is not just about food. This is about dignity, about sovereignty, and it's shaking the very foundations of how the world sees Africa. Because when Africa stops begging, the world starts trembling. Stay with us, because this is not just news. This is the truth that has been buried for many years. Subscribe and stand with us for an Africa that will never bow again. She returned to the land like one returns to a grave. CIA, a village near Bobo Dioulasso, had become a place of silence. Once rich with millet songs and yam rituals, now haunted by the hum of aid trucks and the quiet despair of people fed, but not full, for 2 decades. Aminata had watched those trucks crawl through her village, tarps heavy with grain from strangers. Not once did they stop to ask, what did you grow before we came? Her hands, calloused from memory rather than labor, touched the earth. It cracked under her fingers. She whispered, you are not dead. You are waiting for us to remember. She didn't come for nostalgia. She came because something had been taken. Not just crops, but control. Not just food, but freedom. And standing beside her, boots thick with red dust, was the man they now call dangerous. Captain Ibrahim Traoré. He didn't come with promises. He came with seeds. Cassava stems in one hand, conviction in the other. He asked her one question. What did you grow here? Before the trucks, before the tariffs, before the treaties. She answered without pause. Food. She said, we grew food. And in that moment, something happened that no Western camera dared to capture. A reckoning. This wasn't about cassava. It was about memory, land, and war. A quiet war, fought not with bullets, but with budgets. 4 decades. Africa was told to accept help, but help came in barrels, bags, and bindings. Pesticides that sterilized the soil, loans that choked the treasury. Policies written in Washington, signed in Ouagadougou. They called it development, but it felt like defeat. Traoré knew. He had seen it in soldiers and students, in mothers, who could not explain why they had food but no power, why the rice came, but the dignity didn't. So he made a decision that rattled boardrooms from Brussels to Bretton Woods. $200 million, not borrowed, not donated, but paid from Burkina Faso's own coffers. No conditions, no repayment, no colonial strings, disguised as partnerships. He didn't launch a program. He launched a rebellion. And cassava, that humble root, long mocked as poor man's food, became his weapon. It doesn't need rainfall. It defies drought. It grows where others perish. And most of all, it does not answer to the West. Because what scares them isn't Africa planting, it's Africa refusing to import. Aminata's fingers pressed deeper into the soil. They made us forget, she said, but the land remembers. That morning, the revolution began not with slogans, not with a press release, but with a woman on her knees and a captain in silence. No security, no flag, only seeds. Cassava, yam, resistance. Traoré wasn't planting crops. He was planting the end of submission. And in that act, on a forgotten field, in a forgotten village, he did something world-changing. He treated an old African woman like a sovereign. If that doesn't scare the powerful, it should Because this wasn't aid, this was uprising. And every tuber pulled from that soil would soon carry more than starch. It would carry the scent of defiance. Cassava was no longer food. It was flag. They mocked it. $200 million spent on a route, no foreign consultants, no glossy presentations, just local tools, local hands, and local belief. To them, it looked like madness. But to Burkina Faso, it looked like memory being rebuilt with metal and sun. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré announced the Cassava initiative, skeptics in New York and Geneva scoffed. How could one of the poorest nations on earth fund such an operation? They didn't realize the poverty they counted in dollars. Traoré counted in dignity, and dignity, once reclaimed, can move mountains and tractors, 400 of them. Not imported, not donated, commissioned from within, engineered, assembled, and maintained by young Burkinabe, hands trained at the newly revitalized National Agricultural Institute in Ouagadougou. No Caterpillar logos, no European serial numbers, just red, steel, and black bolts bearing the emblem of the soil they were born to serve. Alongside them, 239 mini plows for smallholder farms, 710 solar-powered water pumps, 714 agricultural motorbikes, not for show, but to reach the fields, long ignored by government and NGO alike. Every machine had a purpose: to restore the land and the pride that had been eroded by decades of dependency. But machines mean nothing without people willing to get their hands dirty. Meet Fatou, a mother of 3 from Tenado. She sold her last pair of gold earrings, family heirlooms passed down from her grandmother, to buy organic compost and cassava cuttings. When asked why she would trade her legacy for roots, she didn't flinch. Because cassava feeds generations. She said, gold feeds pride. Cassava feeds life. Then there's Isaka, a former soldier from Ouagadougou, blinded by a landmine explosion in 2018. In a world that valued strength over sacrifice, he was forgotten. But he returned not to fight with weapons, but with will. Day after day, he dug and extended irrigation furrows with bare hands, teaching others how to feel the slope of the land. Through touch alone, I fought for my country. He told a group of young volunteers, now I fight for its food. And there was a brilliant software engineer who once worked for a French telecom company in Ouagadougou. He had air conditioning, a salary, and a future, but he chose the fields. He returned to his village and built a mobile application in Mooré, Daiula, and French designed to track soil moisture, identify tropical disease threats, and predict flooding patterns for cassava growers. In just 3 months, over 50,000 farmers across 5 provinces downloaded the app. This is what we call local intelligence. He said, not artificial, ancestral. Together, they weren't just planting crops. They were planting a new system, one that didn't wait for permission from Brussels, one that didn't measure success in grant cycles or donor reports, one that remembered. Because before the pesticides, before the imported rice and powdered milk, Africa fed itself. It didn't need statistics to prove worth. It needed sun, water, and faith. Now, with solar panels powering drip lines and cassava growing in rows across what was once scorched earth, Burkina Faso had more than a plan. It had momentum. At sunrise, tractors rumbled to life. At dusk, mobile alerts told farmers when to mulch and rotate. University students debated tensile strength of drip pipe tubing, while elders taught them how to test soil by smell. And as roots deepened into the ground, a question deepened into the nation's soul. What else can we rebuild? If we start from the soil, the land cracked before the world could applaud. By June 2025, just months after the cassava revolution bloomed across the heart of Burkina Faso, The skies closed. No rain. No mercy. Fields that once whispered with hope began to shrivel in silence. Leaves curled under a punishing sun. Tubers failed to swell. Farmers, once bursting with pride, now walked fields in muted grief. Western headlines pounced. Traoré's Cassava gamble wilts under drought rotors. Burkina Faso's agricultural dream crumbles. France 24. The subtext was always the same. We told you Africa couldn't feed itself. But the drought wasn't the deadliest threat. Deadliest came in envelopes. In early July, a joint letter arrived in Ouagadougou from the IMF, the World Bank, and a block of Euro-American lenders. It didn't offer aid, it offered a warning. Abandon the Cassava initiative. Resume grain imports. Stop the experiment. The justification: food security. The drought, they claimed, proved Burkina Faso's program was reckless. Self-reliance was rebranded as instability. Aid dependency was pitched as safety. It was déjà vu not in the fields, but in the corridors of power. Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood at a podium on national television days later. The room was still. His voice, however, was not. They say our cassava has failed. He began, but they do not see the roots that remain. He spoke not of tubers, but of trenches, not of policy, but of pride. He reminded the nation of the 400 tractors, of the 710 solar pumps, of the hands that dug water channels, of the women who sold gold earrings for compost, of the soldier who fought blind, and the engineer who coded freedom into an app. They may control the seeds of death, it declared, but we hold the seeds of life. The message was unmistakable. Burkina Faso would not bow. There would be no return to powdered milk, no re-inking of exploitative trade deals, no compromise for comfort. Traoré announced emergency expansion of the nation's internal water system's wells, solar lines, and trench restoration. He vowed to fight the drought not with desperation, but with design. International pressure mounted. Western think tanks issued forecasts of famine. Financial institutions threatened to withhold unrelated budgetary support. Yet the people did not flinch. Across the countryside, chants rose. No debt, just cassava. And while cameras turned away, farmers turned toward their fields. In Bobo Dioulasso, villagers began repairing the crescent-shaped fanny trenches without orders. In Ouagadougou, engineers worked past midnight reinforcing pump systems. Taxi drivers hauled spare parts when roads were flooded. Teachers taught trench alignment after class. Even children carried buckets to moisten the soil. It wasn't a protest. It was a movement. Traoré didn't just resist pressure. He turned it into purpose. Within 48 hours of his televised address, he convened a summit not in a palace, but under cassava trees. No microphones, no translators, just governors, elders, engineers, mothers. They launched something extraordinary. Dig before you beg. A national grassroots campaign to build emergency water retention systems. Not someday, but now. Over 10,000 volunteers responded within 2 days. Fanny-style techniques were revived and taught at sunrise. Clay-lined trenches appeared overnight. Solar drip systems were repositioned by former telecom engineers, now turned agricultural warriors. This wasn't aid. This was engineering. This wasn't survival. It was sovereignty under pressure. And as the sun scorched harder, the country dug deeper. One trench, one pump, one root at a time. It wasn't a policy. It wasn't a press release. It was a heartbeat. 48 hours after Captain Ibrahim Traoré's national address, Burkina Faso erupted not in panic, but in purpose. What began as a drought response became something far greater, a mobilization unseen in modern African history. They called it dig before you beg. No generals led the charge. No donors funded the mission. But by the second sunrise, Over 10,000 volunteers had taken to the fields with nothing but shovels, buckets, and belief. In Gawa, a school headmistress named Madame Diarra stood before her students, not with books but with trench diagrams. By mid-afternoon, teenagers were lining soil with clay, carrying stones, and carving water paths into the earth. In Kaya, a local imam, beard white, voice soft, joined a brigade of farmers reinforcing dried-up irrigation canals. His words were few, but his presence thundered. Faith without action is drought. Taxi drivers in Bobo Dioulasso stopped their meters and started hauling solar pump parts. Mechanics welded broken pipe fittings by candlelight. Formas Oljas retrained young volunteers in trench slope calculation. And above them all the cassava fields, brittle and brown, waiting like soldiers in retreat, but not yet defeated. Engineers from the National Agricultural Institute set up mobile training hubs across rural zones. At sunrise, they taught volunteers how to line trenches with clay, how to angle the fanny curves, how to reconnect solar-powered drip lines. It was technical, it was ancestral, it was war. The message? We will water them with belief. And if belief is not enough, we organize. Captain Traoré didn't watch from a distance. He walked trench to trench, side by side, with villagers. At one site, he paused before a glistening, mocha-colored canal freshly dug in midday heat. He turned to a group of sunburned teenagers and said, "This soil remembers those who fight for it. We will cultivate every last drop it gives." By day 3, the machinery responded. All 400 tractors were repurposed, no longer tilling now, hauling gravel and clay to the trench perimeters. 239 mini-plows tore through compacted earth, creating absorption basins. 714 agricultural motorbikes carried fuel, food, and tools between villages. And then the sound they'd all been praying for humming. Solar pumps, once idle, flickered back to life, powered by sun, operated by youth under 30, including the former telecom engineer No himself. He stood, arms grease-covered, eyes locked on the pressure gauge. "It's flowing," he whispered. "It's flowing again." By late August, data from the Finance Ministry, cross-verified with satellite imaging from the Burkina Faso Meteorological Agency, confirmed it. A 15% increase in retained soil moisture across trial zones. Nearly half the withered cassava fields began to recover. Stems stiffened. Leaves spread. The brown gave way to green. Farmers began whispering. The cassava is sighing in relief. Hope, once withering, now rooted. Traoré called for province-wide briefings. He didn't stand alone. He stood with the women who dug 10 kilometers of microditches in Gawa, the engineers who restored 200 solar pumps, the taxi drivers who outran floodwaters to deliver parts. On the 30th of August, before national television, he stood on a newly restored farm near Bobo Dioulasso and declared, "Let the world note this. 50% of fields rescued. No. Foreign check issued. Just raw courage, human unity, and African engineering." The world barely blinked. But Burkina Faso rose. What began with a whisper in CIA roared into a movement across the continent. By early September, Burkina Faso, once dismissed as a dusty outpost of foreign aid, had become the center of a continental awakening. The Cassava Revolution had not only revived fields, it had revived faith, not in aid, not in trade, but in people. In the capital, Ouagadougou, farmers marched shoulder to shoulder, cassava tubers hoisted like trophies, women in bright pagnas, ex-soldiers in faded uniforms, students in sweatshirts bearing the National Agricultural Institute's crest. Their chant thundered, "We do not eat conferences, we eat what we grow." Behind them, local drummers pounded rhythms once reserved for royal ceremonies, now thundering for roots. Cassava, once ignored, now paraded like a crown jewel. The moment went viral. Live streamed by Burkina Faso latest news. It spread like wildfire. In Accra, Ghana, farmers marched with cassava cuttings in hand. In Lagos, Nigeria, rooftop gardens bloomed with tubers. In Nairobi, Kenya, agricultural students danced barefoot around cassava hills, shouting from roots to resilience. What Traoré had planted in soil, his people had lifted into song. But the most striking moment came on a crisp morning at the National Agricultural Institute. Nearly 200,000 people gathered for what they called the Cassava Summit. Delegates arrived from every corner. Gawa, Ouagadougou, Kaya carrying soil from their home fields. Not just dirt, but memory, legacy, unity. As they poured their earth into a communal trough, a mosaic formed a living map of the nation's will. No borders, no regions, just soil. Joined. At the center stood Captain Ibrahim Traoré, not in uniform, not on a platform. He wore a khaki jacket stained with cassava soil. Around him, silence, not of submission, but reverence. He didn't raise a fist. He raised his voice. They told us to kneel. They told us to import, but we rise. We do not eat resolutions. We grow revolutions. The crowd didn't cheer. They wept. They prayed. And then they stood. That same week, at the United Nations in New York, Ambassador Isatu Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso's permanent representative, echoed his words before a stunned General Assembly. We do not eat conferences. We grow our courage. BBC and Al Jazeera played the clip on loop. Analysts called it historic. The first time an African nation equated agriculture with sovereign defiance, the ripple effect was real. In Ghana, clinics began baking cassava bread, reducing food import costs by 25%. In Nigeria, a new brand of cassava crisps called From Roots to Resilience hit Lagos street markets. In Kenya, export talks began with regional airlines to deliver cassava flour to school programs. And in Europe, Denmark sent a delegation to study Burkina Faso's trench system, calling it the most synchronized grassroots response we've ever seen in Africa. No one expected it, but those who dug the trenches weren't surprised. They had planted more than cassava. They had planted something ancient and overdue. In Beira, Mozambique, a newspaper headline read, Cassava Diplomacy. Africa's soil fights imperial hunger. In Berlin, academics studied the Ouagadougou summit as a case of decentralized pan-African civic engineering. But Traoré had no interest in academic applause. He returned to the fields, to the trenches, to the roots. When asked by a young volunteer, Captain, what flag do we carry now? He answered, looking down at a cassava plant growing firm in the red earth. This one, cassava, was no longer food. It was a flag of defiance, of memory, of self-determination, of a continent that finally chose to plant instead of plead. So, what now? Will the world finally see cassava for what it has become, not a root, but a revolution? In Burkina Faso, they already do, because this isn't just agriculture. It's sovereignty. It's defiance. It's a nation that no longer waits to be saved but dares to plant itself into history. Cassava, once dismissed as poor man's food, now feeds not just stomachs, but movements. It is the tuber that told the IMF no, that turned drought into determination and made trench digging a national right. And in the dusty fields of Bobo Dioulasso, in the hands of Fatu, of Isaka, of No, we saw something greater than harvest. We saw a people sowing the seeds of tomorrow with courage, not contracts. Across the continent, others are watching. In Ghana, in Kenya, in Nigeria, They whisper the same question. What if we planted our pride? The soil remembers. It remembers every ancestor who tilled with bare hands, every grandmother who saved the seed, every child who carried water under the sun. It remembers before the trucks came, before powdered milk, before policy papers told us who we were, and now we remember too. This isn't just Captain Ibrahim's latest news. This is the truth. They buried under debt and treaties, and it is rising one cassava shoot at a time. So we ask you, what flag do you carry? What future do you plant? And if you believe cassava is more than food, if you believe it is a future type, NEW Africa in the comments below. And if this report has stirred something in you, don't just scroll. Speak, share. Let them know we are watching. We are remembering. We are growing. Like, comment, subscribe. Because they hid our history long enough, now we speak it. With roots, with truth, with our own hands. This is not just Burkina Faso's latest news. This is the future our ancestors planted. And it's sprouting now. See you in the next harvest, the next hope, the next truth. They don't want you to know,